Have you ever made up stories about your toys? This is a story about some toys that were bought in America and what happened when their owner found them again years later in her mother's attic in London. They wrote a famous book about them, which has, at its heart, a message of overcoming first impressions and making friends with someone who is very different to you. In Britain, the American minstrel doll was metamorphosed into the magical Golliwogg, which not only broke down racial stereotypes, but became a beacon for tolerance and our multicultural society. This book, The Adventures of Two Dutch Dolls, was written in 1895 by Bertha Upton and illustrated by her daughter Florence. It is about some of the toys that Florence owned as a little girl, but the story was written when she was a grown-up to help her pay her way through art college. At the same time, in the United States, a series of segregation laws, the so-called Jim Crow laws, were being enacted to make sure that people of different skin colours would live separate lives. Yet, here on the front cover, the black character is hand in hand with the white ones. From the very start, the Golliwogg was breaking down barriers. Although Bertha and Florence were English, the story is set in a New York toy shop, and it is a classic Toys Come to Life on Christmas Eve story. You can visit the original toys at the Museum of Childhood at Bethnal Green in London. The first toys that come to life are the Dutch dolls of the title, and the first thing they do is to find an American flag with which to make themselves some clothes, an action that in America is probably treasonable. They get up to all sorts of antics, until from out of nowhere appears the Golliwogg. As far as anyone knows, Golliwogg was their own made-up name. He is described as the blackest gnome, so in the story he is identified as one of the fairy folk. The fairy folk were to Victorians what aliens from Mars are to children now, an entity totally different from anything you had ever come across before. With his oversized head and long hair, the Golliwogg looked just as outlandish to the Victorians. To British eyes, he was dressed like a fashionable Victorian gentleman of the time. He looked like Charles Dickens. Initially, the extraordinary Golliwogg scares the living daylights out of the two Dutch dolls. But by the next page, they are trying to chat him up. This is very much a story about accepting and befriending someone who is totally different from you. Back in the toy shop, even more toys come to life as the story builds towards the grand ball for Christmas Eve. Of particular interest are the pictures of the African costume doll, who goes against Jim Crow etiquette by dancing with Sarah Jane, and of the American minstrel doll, who, with his banjo, is providing the music for the dance, because unlike these dolls, Golliwogg is of the fairy folk and is not meant to be human. If you see a figure that you think is meant to be human, then it isn't a Golliwogg. Like the later teddy bear, Gollywoggs have gender, but no race. The friends are getting tired of the dance and decide to make their escape from the toy shop. They go off sledging and sliding and have a snowball fight. You just know that the whole thing will end in total disaster, and the story ends with the most bedraggled Golliwogg you ever saw. It was the black Golliwogg rather than the wooden dolls that caught the public imagination, and at the turn of the last century, Bertha and Florence wrote a dozen books about the adventurous Golliwogg. He enjoyed inventing and exploring. He built an auto go-kart, entered a bicycle race, travelled the world, and even went up in an airship. With their sense of fun and cartoon-style illustrations, they were very different from the usual children's stories of the time, which would have a strong moral message. However, to modern readers, the books aren't always politically correct in their dealings with characters from other countries. But at no point is it suggested that the Golliwogg himself is human. Gollywoggs soon appeared as toys. The later teddy bears were factory-made toys for middle-class children, but a Golliwogg ragdoll was easily knitted or made from scraps of fabric at home. As an adventurous spirit, he was an acceptable doll for small boys, one of the few without a military connotation. However, I have seen a letter from a World War I British soldier who, in a letter home, thanked his family for sending him a lucky Golliwogg. By the 1920s, the Golliwogg in Britain had come to represent good, wholesome childhood, in the same way as teddy bears do now. Those children no more associated their toy Gollywoggs with slavery than today's children associate their favourite teddy bears with blood sports. This was reflected in all sorts of advertising. Germaline depicted him empathising when you had hurt yourself, whilst Ovaltine and Oxo showed him as the toy you tucked to bed with you. However, it was Robertsons who will be forever associated with Golly. For 3 tokens off their jars, children could send away for a high-quality enamel Golly brooch. Over 20 million was sent out over 70 years, with special editions raising money for a variety of good causes. It was probably the longest and best-loved loyalty scheme in British retailing. However, there was one group of people who really didn't like Gollywoggs. In 1934, just a year after coming into power, the Nazi Party had banned all Gollywoggs and black dolls in Germany, the only government ever to do so. The children's newspaper clearly saw this banishment as an omen of what was to come.
But now that he is banned by the Nazis, Mr. Golliwogg acquires a fresh importance. He is almost a martyr.
The London Evening Standard reported in 1936,
German children this year will not be allowed black dolls or Gollywoggs.
A Nazi spokesman said the reason being that Aryan children might come to love them and think blacks were their equals. Of course, the Nazis had a point because that is exactly what had been happening in Britain. By the time the Americans joined World War II, 2 generations of British children had grown up with the Golliwogg books, and the picture of the African doll and the magical Gollywogg enjoying the dance together was familiar to everyone. In contrast, the Americans had had 2 generations growing up under the so-called Jim Crow segregation laws, so white American soldiers were astonished to find that English women not only enjoyed dancing with black GIs, but were proud to have them as steady boyfriends. In Britain, the minstrel doll in his new guise as the Gollywogg had helped to turn racism on its head. In Britain, our children were having a tough time. Millions had been evacuated, sweets were rationed, and toy shops were empty because the toy factories were now making things more useful to the war effort. Every Christmas and every birthday, parents wondered what on earth they could give their children as a present. Everything was in short supply, apart from the blackout fabric used to make heavy curtains to avoid homes being seen by the enemy aircraft. Most English children had a homemade Golly, and with his familiar friendly face, he gave them comfort in troubled times. Often they were crudely made, but frequently these toys were loved to bits. In her mass observation diary, Nella Last recorded how she made dozens of Gollywoggs. Many were given to her local hospital. For later generations who have so much, to say to the wartime generation that their beloved toys are now unacceptable is culturally very insensitive. One customer of the Ginger Pop shop told us how she was evacuated to live with her grandparents in the countryside. She had very few toys, so her grandmother made her a Gollywogg from scraps of fabric, but his black hair was made from the fur of the rabbit they had eaten for dinner. Over the years, many authors have written stories about Gollywoggs. Enid Blyton was born just 2 years after the first book came out, and they would have been her childhood reading. When she became an author herself, her stories for very young children often had a moral twist, with toys in the nursery acting out the roles, good and bad. Stories such as The White Gollywogg showed children how upsetting it is to be bullied, and that a person's character cannot be judged by their skin colour. This is a copy of the first letter sent by the Dutch illustrator Harmsen van der Beek to Enid Blyton. Noddy and his friends are shown here for the very first time. And who is the special one who was chosen to give her the flowers? Yet a problem arose because Enid Blyton had made her Gollywoggs both good and bad characters, which wasn't acceptable to those who thought that black characters should only be depicted as being good. Of course, Gollies usually are good, so to have a gang of bad uns appear in Noddy Book 4, Here Comes Noddy Again, who then stole Noddy's car, was doubly shocking to young readers. It was a clever twist in the tale by a master storyteller. Some people persist in saying that all Enid Blyton's Gollies were bad. they forget that amongst the good was Mr. Golly, the garage owner, who was the most successful businessman in Toyland and who had given Noddy his car in the first place. Professor David Rudd countered all the Gollies and Teddies in the Noddy books as part of his PhD and assures us that there are far more bad Teddies than Gollies in the Noddy books. In the early 1990s, someone who had mistakenly thought that Gollywoggs were unpleasant caricatures of black people decided to replace them in the Noddy books, often with monkeys, presumably because they thought that monkeys were better than black people. This was political correctness gone mad, because something that wasn't racist had been replaced by something that most certainly was. Enid Blyton's books would be further bowdlerised, with the good Gollies and the wishing chair stories being replaced by a teddy, and in the Amelia Jane stories by Action Man. The first major toy fair in Britain was held in Brighton in 1954, and this poster shows that just one toy was chosen to represent the entire British toy industry. This immigrant had done well. In a little under 60 years, the Gollywogg had become possibly the best-loved toy in Britain and was popular throughout the Commonwealth. The Ginger Pop shop has sold Gollywoggs to adults from around the world. There was a group of grannies on a day trip from London, but originally from the West Indies, who giggled like schoolgirls as they chose their Golly keyrings. Customers from Africa, who didn't understand what the fuss was about. And a lady who chose the most expensive ones in the window in memory of the Gollies that her West Indian mother had bought her when she was a little girl. This little boy dressed up as a Gollywogg, his favourite book character, in 1950. He was no more racist than modern Englishmen are misogynistic when they don oversized breasts and miniskirts. The costumes aren't everyone's cup of tea, but in neither case are the protagonists being malicious or disrespectful. In the 1970s, the Gollywogg returned to a life of high adventure, taking to both the sea and air, and becoming something of a national hero. Our top yachtswoman of the time was Claire Francis, and she persuaded her former employer to sponsor her boat. When she knocked 3 days off the women's world record for sailing the Atlantic single-handedly, her yacht, Robertson's Golly, had pride of place at the London Boat Show. The World Ballooning Championships were held at Castle Howard in 1977. Robertson's had sponsored the event, so their balloons were chosen to go on the front cover of the official programme. It was the first appearance of Golly 3, Britain's first fancy-shaped hot air balloon. There is nothing inherently racist about the British Gollywogg, yet he has been persistently stereotyped and slandered by people who have rarely read the books. Comments which have often been repeated by lazy journalists for so-called balance. Indeed, far from being an offensive object, within the UK, our Gollywogg has historically been a symbol of tolerance. It doesn't make sense that people who love Gollywoggs and don't associate them with black people are considered racist. Yet people who dislike Gollywoggs and say they're ugly dolls resembling black people aren't deemed racist. Monica Williams comes from Peterborough, Ontario, where, with her husband, she runs a UK import shop. She was very upset to get complaints about the Gollywoggs they were selling by some people who knew nothing about them, hadn't read the books, but assumed that the toys must somehow be racist simply because they were black. Monica is very proud to say that her aunt, grandmother and great-grandmother were and still are collectors of many black history collectibles. Chaka Artwell doesn't like other people telling him what is or isn't racist, and he is often to be seen out and about in Oxford with his Gollywogg. He explains that the Gollywogg ban in Britain started with the Greater London Council in 1983, even though it wasn't an issue for Afro-Caribbean people at the time. He believes that the ban was actually a distraction from the real problems his community faced, such as the sus laws, mental health, and educational issues. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and to his proud owner, this Gollywogg is beautiful. Sadly, there are people out there who, for their own reasons, only feel happy when they make other people's life a misery. Gollywoggs, coconuts and marmalade are all good things with which bullies have taunted their victims. Yet it is nonsensical to ban any of them, because to do so is to tacitly agree that the bully has made a valid point, so their warped worldview prevails. It is equally daft not to give him his proper name for fear of giving offence, because so far as anyone knows, the name is totally made up. If you want to take small rude words out of longer ordinary words, would you ask football fans to take the arse out of Arsenal? And whatever would become of this pretty little Dorset hamlet? All sorts of customers of the ginger pop shop have acquired the nickname Golly. For some, it was because the way that their hair grew. Some were called Robertson, and one had grandchildren who couldn't pronounce granny. None of these people thought the name derogatory. All of these people were white. But there is a fine line where good-natured banter becomes spiteful bullying. Some people watching this video are bullies. Please, go and sort out your own issues because you have no right to spoil your victims' lives. And keep our gollywog out of it. Here's about tolerance, not hateful racism. At the start of 2015, journalists were murdered for publishing cartoons that some other people found offensive. Millions of people took to the streets to assert their right to freedom of speech and the principle that no one has the right not to be offended. This film has been made to show that no one needs to be offended by the gollywog. Golliwoggs are a force for good, and we can be proud that here in Britain we have them within our multicultural tradition.